Yeah.
Yes, we are. Hello, Venerable.
Hello, good evening. I hope everyone is well. So today we will again start with some prayers, taking refuge in bodhicitta and the four measurables, and then a few recitations of the Buddha's mantra. And then I thought it would be nice to do a short meditation on some of the things we were looking at yesterday, particularly anger, how we can apply these ideas to working on feelings of anger that arise in our mind. So while doing the prayers of refuge and bodhicitta, if you want, you can imagine the Buddha in the space in front of you. Feel the Buddha's compassion, love, wisdom, and other excellent qualities. Feel you're in the Buddha's presence and feel inspired by the Buddha's energy to help your own mind develop those positive qualities.
I take refuge until
Awakened in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, by the merit I create, by listening to the Dharma, I will attain Buddhahood in order to benefit all sentient beings. I take refuge until I have awakened in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. By the merit I create, by listening to the Dharma, I will attain Buddhahood in order to benefit all sentient beings. I take refuge until I have awakened in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. By the merit I create, by listening to the Dharma, I will attain Buddhahood in order to benefit all sentient beings.
May all sentient beings
Have happiness and happiness. May all sentient beings be free of suffering and its causes. May all sentient beings not be separated from sorrowless bliss. May all sentient beings abide in equanimity, free of bias, attachment, and anger.
Ayata
Om Mune Mune Maha Mune Soha Tata Om Mune Mune Maha Mune Soha Tata Om Mune Mune Maha Mune Soha. So now take a few more moments to generate a positive, altruistic motivation for being here, participating in this session. If you're comfortable with the idea of bodhicitta, becoming a Buddha, to be able to help all living beings, you can bring that into your mind as your reason for being here. But if you're not yet so familiar or comfortable with that motivation, then try to generate a sense of altruism, wanting to help others as much as you can, to relieve their suffering, to bring them peace and happiness, and aspire to learn something from this course that will enable you to be of greater benefit to others. So now we'll do a meditation to see how we can apply some of the tools I spoke about yesterday on working with anger. See how these can apply to our own experiences of anger. So bring to mind an incident where you did feel angry, some kind of anger. You may have expressed your anger in your words or your actions, or you may have just felt it in your mind and didn't show it on the outside. So how do you feel about anger? Do you feel it's useful, it's helpful, something you want to continue experiencing? Or do you see it as something disturbing and harmful, cause of problems? So yesterday I mentioned some adverse consequences of anger. It can disturb our mind and our health, our happiness. It can also lead to problems for others if we act it out, and they can suffer. And it can have more long-term consequences. If we act out our anger, we create karma that is the cause of suffering and problems in the future. And it's also an obstacle to our spiritual development. We have the potential to develop really beautiful, wonderful, peaceful states of mind, especially enlightenment, being a Buddha, also liberation, nirvana, and other realizations along the path. So as long as there's anger in our mind and we're not overcoming our anger, we won't be able to attain those states. And understand that you do have a choice. Just because anger comes up in your mind doesn't mean you have to get caught up in it, believe in it, act it out. There are alternatives. You can learn to manage your anger and even transform your mind into something more positive and constructive instead of anger. So one thing we can do to manage anger is to understand the other person. Sometimes we don't really understand them, or we might misinterpret what they're doing, why they're doing it. So spend some time trying to understand the other person and put yourself in their shoes. Try to see things from their perspective. Why did they behave that way? And you might be able to discover something you didn't understand before. You might understand that they actually had a positive intention for what they were doing. Or maybe they were confused or disturbed by some problem in their life. So you may need more time to really understand the other person, so you can continue doing that at another time. But even just making the attempt to understand the other person can help to soften your mind towards them instead of being hard with anger. Also, it's helpful to contemplate that the other person is basically just like me, just like everyone. They are a human being. They want happiness. They want to fulfill their needs and their wishes and not have suffering and problems. And it's quite likely that what they did that upset you was simply an attempt to fulfill their needs and their wishes and find happiness and avoid suffering. And instead of being angry, annoyed, irritated towards them, it would feel much better to have the wish that they could be happy and to be free of suffering. See if you can bring that thought, that feeling into your mind. Even just saying to yourself how nice it would be if that person could be happy and could be free of their suffering. So that's the meaning of love and compassion. And those states of mind are much more satisfying for ourselves to have in our minds than anger, which is quite painful and disturbing. So see if you can feel a wish to increase that type of thought, that type of feeling of love and compassion. And that itself is a helpful countermeasure to anger. The more we can feel love and compassion for others, more and more people and living beings, the less likely it will be that we will react with anger towards them. So one other thing I thought of to share with you regarding anger, and this is also applicable to the other disturbing emotions, is to understand where they come from. When we get angry at another person, we may feel as if it's the other person who made us angry. And we even say that. I don't know, maybe not everybody, but we sometimes say, oh, that person makes me so angry. And so when we're saying that, it's almost like we're saying the other person somehow put anger in my mind. I didn't have any anger in my mind before. They came along and did that or said that, and suddenly I'm angry. So it's coming from them. So we blame the other person for making us angry. But that's not true. It's not possible for somebody else to put anger in our mind. Rather, if anger comes up in our mind, it's because there was a seed of anger in our mind. So the way it's explained in Buddhism is we have all these seeds of disturbing emotions in our mind that are left there by previous experiences of that emotion. So we got angry in the past, probably hundreds of times or thousands of times or millions of times just in this lifetime. And when we get angry, then one of the effects of anger, the anger, goes away, but it leaves a seed in the mind, just like trees, they produce seeds that fall on the ground, and then when they're nourished, those seeds grow into new trees. So it's similar in our mind. Seeds of disturbing emotions are left by previous experiences of those emotions. And then those seeds are there in the mind. And then when we meet certain circumstances, such as somebody doing something we don't like or whatever, then that's like watering the seed so that it produces an experience of anger. And so the other person is just providing the condition, but the main cause, the real cause, are the seeds in our mind. And that's why, like in the case of the Buddha, Buddha doesn't have any more seeds of anger. Buddha has cleared all those away, freed his or her mind from all those seeds. So even if somebody comes up and insults the Buddha or tries to harm the Buddha in some way, there's no anger in the Buddha's mind because of having eliminated the seeds. So that's something to think about, to contemplate, and that itself can be helpful to decrease our anger, to understand the main cause is these seeds in my mind left over from the past. So if I really want to stop having anger, I need to work on my own mind, reduce my anger, stop creating more seeds, producing more seeds of anger. And another condition for the ripening of the seeds are attitudes that we have, that we carry around. For example, a sense of self-importance. This is something we all have. A kind of feeling like I am the most important person in the world. I am the center of everything. Everything should go my way. Everybody should be nice to me and do what I want them to do and not do what I don't want them to do. So we have these kind of attitudes that we carry around, and they're so habitual, we don't even notice them. And most other people have those attitudes as well. So it just seems like normal. But according to Buddhism, those kind of attitudes are another big cause of disturbing emotions. Because if we have that kind of attitude, then as soon as somebody does something we don't like, we feel I have the right to be angry at them and tell them off and get them to change. So that's something else to look at, to try to recognize that attitude of self-importance or selfishness, self-centeredness. That's very difficult to work on because it's very, very deep. But still, it's good to at least recognize that. And there are things we can do to work on it, like becoming more altruistic, changing our focus, being less self-centered, more others-centered, more concerned about others. We could definitely do that. It takes time, but it is possible. And like one of the ways to do that, as we talked about yesterday, is generating a positive motivation in the morning or at some time, whenever you can. It's good to do it in the morning before you start your day. And you can use somebody else's words that you find inspiring, or compose your own using words and ideas that feel right to you, that express, this is the way I want to be, this is the way I want to live my life. And it can change as well. You can always change it later if you think differently, but something that will help you generate more altruism, more concern for others, and make that your main attitude rather than self-centeredness. But of course, that doesn't mean we don't take care of ourselves. We do need to take care of ourselves, because if we do want to help others, we need to be happy and healthy and have a good, clear mind and so on. So we definitely need to take care of ourselves and improve ourselves, but doing that not just for me and my happiness, but so that I can be more beneficial for others. So find some way of expressing that, and then, renewing that motivation each day, or even several times a day. And especially when we're doing Dharma activities like listening to teachings, doing meditation and prayers and so on, it's always good to renew that motivation. So by doing that slowly, that kind of attitude becomes more and more genuine, more and more real, the way we really want to be and the way we really are. So it starts to become our kind of default mode through familiarity. But we do need to make some effort to do that. And if we make that effort slowly, slowly, we will change. Also, if we work on being less self-centered and more altruistic, that itself is very helpful as an antidote to negative emotions, disturbing emotions. And also being more happy, having a happier mind and better relationships with others and so on. So there's many, many benefits to altruism. I think Mathieu Ricard wrote a whole book about altruism. It's like this big. So if you have any doubt that that's a worthwhile thing to do, you might read his book. Okay, so then I'm going to move on. I didn't get any further questions from anybody, so I'll just carry on. So I'll talk now about attachment, which is another of the disturbing emotions explained in Buddhism. It's a little tricky because that word attachment is used in psychology, Western psychology, as something positive and useful. For example, it said that a child, especially an infant and a small child, there needs to be attachment between especially the mother and the child. They need to have some attachment to each other. Otherwise, the mother won't take care of the child, and the child would not want to be with the mother. So there needs to be that, a certain amount of attachment there so that the mother will give affection and nourishment to the child, and the child will grow up not just physically healthy, but also mentally, emotionally healthy. So in Buddhism, the term attachment is used somewhat differently. It's explained as a state of mind that arises. It could be towards a person, but it could also be towards an inanimate object like food, music, and so on. And there's an element of exaggeration that happens when we have attachment. We don't really see the other person or the object in a realistic way, but we see them as much more wonderful and pleasurable and attractive than they are. So like when falling in love with somebody, your mind kind of creates this image of the other person as being just so wonderful, like Prince Charming or Princess Cinderella or whatever. So there's exaggeration. There may also be superimposition, like projecting things onto the other person that you want to be there, but may not be there. And then your mind also may get carried away with all kinds of fantasies about how wonderful it would be if you could be with that person. And there's also the tendency to ignore or deny any faults, any imperfections about the person. You don't want to look at those. You don't want to deal with those. So let's just pretend they're not there. But later, those usually appear. And so that's why relationships often go wrong. So that can happen with people, but it can also happen with other kinds of objects like money or clothing or houses or cars or electronic devices or music, entertainment, and so on. So there's so many different things we can get attached to. We can also get attached to ideas, beliefs, religion, or political groups, and so on and so forth. So just about anything could be an object that we get attached to. And it's more difficult to see the faults of attachment than with anger. You can easily see how anger leads to suffering, violence, and even ending up committing a crime and being in prison. Whereas attachment is a little more sneaky. Not so easy to see its faults. So I'll mention some of the faults, and you can check these for yourself if they're true. So one is just the fact that our mind is not seeing things realistically, but it has a lot of unrealistic ideas and views and expectations. So we probably all had our experiences of that in our life with people that we fell in love with or people we were attracted to or other kinds of objects that we thought, oh, I have to have that. I have to buy that. And if I do, wow, it'll be so wonderful. It'll be so fantastic. I mean, we started doing that when we're little kids with toys, I remember very clearly Christmas, at Christmas, before Christmas, we usually write a list of the things that we want. And then our parents buy at least some of them, maybe not all of them. But then Christmas morning, it's like, we're so excited. Oh, I got that toy that I wanted or that doll that I wanted. But after playing with it for a couple of hours, already we're bored, and want to do something else. But then as we grow older, the kind of toys that we want get more sophisticated. Then we want a motorcycle and a car and a phone and so on and so forth. But with each of these things, if you check carefully, they may give us a certain amount of pleasure for a certain amount of time, but sooner or later that pleasure fades. And it's no longer so wonderful and exciting. And also we may discover things about it that, that don't work very well, or they, aren't that fantastic. And also the manufacturing industry understands this very well. You understand the tendency to get dissatisfied with things that we own and buy and use. And they're always coming out with new versions, right? So every year there's new models of cars, new models of phones, computers, clothing, shoes, so on, to entice us, to keep up with the latest and spend more money, which will, benefit them. Yeah, so this is playing into the human tendency to have attachment, desire, wanting the latest, wanting the best, wanting the fastest, the most enjoyable, and so on and so forth. So then it's good to look at our experience and ask ourselves, does following attachment, desire, really bring happiness, satisfaction? One of the verses in Shanti Deva's text, I don't remember the exact words, but the idea is something like, attachment never leads to happiness, because if we have attachment or desire for something, then there's two things that can happen. Either we get what we want or we don't get what we want, because that happens too. Sometimes we want things, but we're not able to get them. And if we don't get what we want, we're miserable because we have this strong desire and that doesn't get fulfilled. But on the other hand, he says, even if we do get what we want, we'll still be unhappy. That's harder to see. But if we look at our experience, our past experiences, then we'll probably realize, yeah, that's true too. It doesn't turn out to be the way I thought it would be, or it changes. Yeah, maybe it's, nice for a while, but then eventually it wears down, it gets beat up. It doesn't stay nice and new like when I first bought it. That's just inevitable. Things can't stay perfect and nice and new unless you don't use them. And you leave the car there and you never drive it, or you leave the pair of shoes in the box and never wear them. Then they'll stay nice. But then what's the point? Yeah. So this is something to check, something to investigate. For some people, it's very obvious, very easy to recognize, but for others, it's not. And and then also the Buddha, there's a saying of the Buddha where he compared following desire to drinking salt water. So if we're really thirsty and we have some salty water, we drink that. So initially it might give us a little satisfaction because it's wet and cool, but the salt content of the water just increases our thirst. So instead of being satisfied, we just become more thirsty. We want to drink more. And so this is another aspect of attachment or desire, that following desire, trying to get more and more and better, just leads to more desire, more dissatisfaction rather than satisfaction. So that's something we need to investigate to see if that's true or not. It's kind of subtle. But the Buddha's solution is to temper our desires and learn contentment, learn to be content with what we have. That doesn't mean we never buy a new pair of shoes. If our shoes are full of holes and falling apart, yeah, then we need to buy a new one, but not to buy like Imelda Marcos. I don't know how many pairs of shoes she had, probably more than you could wear if you had a different pair of shoes every day. So this is what often happens, that our desires just run wild and we buy more than we really need. And so to again find a middle way of having what we need and learning to be content with that, learning to be satisfied with that. Also, attachment is a big obstacle to spiritual development. And anyone who tries to meditate should recognize that, because even, a relatively simple practice like focusing on the breathing and, trying to stay with the breathing as it's coming in and going out. We might be able to do that for a few seconds, but then our mind starts running here and there. And if we look at where our mind is going when it's not doing what it's supposed to do, most of the time it's going to objects of attachment. And this could include past experiences, nice experiences we had in the past, movies we saw, music we listened to, people we spent time with, beautiful places we visited, and meals that we ate. And so, in our mind, there's all these memories of these pleasant experiences in the past. And the mind wants to relive those, to kind of experience them again, get more pleasure from those experiences, or even fantasize about going back to that place, doing that thing again in order to get pleasure. So a lot of our distractions when we try to meditate or study or whatever it is you're doing are due to attachment. And in addition to memories of the past, our mind also creates fantasies of the future. Yeah? Things I want to do tomorrow, next week, next month, next year, places I want to visit, things I want to buy, people I want to meet, and so on. And so that's also related to attachment, wanting those pleasant experiences, imagining that they will bring satisfaction and pleasure. And then also we can be distracted by present pleasant things. Like if we're trying to meditate and maybe one of our neighbors starts playing music and it's a kind of music we like, then our mind will get distracted to that. Or we smell something, maybe we're in a neighborhood where there's a bakery and they're baking croissants or something delicious, and that smell comes in and we get distracted by that and imagine, okay, I'm going to finish my meditation quickly and go and get a fresh croissant, coffee. So present experiences, sense objects, can also distract our attention. But it's not those objects. The problem isn't the objects themselves, but our attitude of attachment. If we didn't have attachment, like if the Buddha was sitting there meditating and the smell of fresh croissant came in the window, he wouldn't have attachment because he's overcome attachment. So again, the problem is not the external objects, people, things, but rather the attitude of attachment in our mind, which we've had for a long time, forever. And there's seeds of attachment. So they get ripened, nourished, and new experiences of attachment come up. So spend some time looking at your own life, your own experiences, and also the experiences of others, um, to see what kind of problems can come with attachment. Probably the most obvious problems would be with regard to addiction. So addiction to drugs, alcohol, gambling, those are forms of addiction that are clearly harmful. They can harm people's life and health, and relationships and livelihood and so on. That we all have our own addictions if we're honest with ourselves. It may be addiction to chocolate or some other kind of food or drink, or addiction to uh, people being nice to us, liking us, saying nice words to us, and so on and so forth. So Buddhism, there's this teaching about what are called 8 worldly concerns. So there are 4 pairs of opposites of things that we can get addicted to, but also have aversion to the opposite experience. So they are gain and loss. So wanting gain, wanting to increase our possessions, our wealth, and so on. So we're happy when that happens. But when the opposite happens, like loss, we lose money, the stock market goes down, we lose money, or we lose an object, we leave it somewhere and it disappears, or somebody steals it, or it breaks down. So whenever we experience loss, then our mind goes down, becomes unhappy. So there's attachment to gain and aversion to loss. And then another pair is praise and blame. So when people praise us, compliment us, say sweet words, things we want to hear, we're happy, our mind goes up. But if we get the opposite kind of words like blame, criticism, pointing out our faults, even if it's true, we don't really want to hear it. So then our mind goes down, becomes unhappy. And then another pair is kind of similar. It's reputation and lack of reputation. So that has to do not so much with what people are saying in our ears, but further away, like what people are saying about us or thinking about us. And so we like to be known for who we are and what we've done. And so if we get a little bit of fame, now it's easy to do that. You just create a Facebook account or whatever. You can, I guess it doesn't happen with everybody, but you can get hundreds or thousands of likes of friends. And so when we are known in a positive way for what we are and what we do and our talents and so on, we're very happy about that, happy to be known. They have a good reputation. But if the opposite happens, if we have a bad reputation, if people are saying, or thinking bad things about us behind our back or around the world, then we're miserable, very unhappy. And then the last pair is pleasure and the lack of it, or the opposite of pleasure. So this has to do with mainly this 5 sense experiences. So we have 5 senses: seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, and tactile or body sense. So whenever we encounter any pleasant experience with any of those 5 senses, we're so happy. We love it. We want more and more and more of that kind of experience. But then, we can't always have pleasant experiences. There are unpleasant ones, ugly things that we may see or hear, smell, taste, or feel in our body, like unpleasant sensations. So when we encounter those, our mind goes down, becomes unhappy, miserable. So these are really fantastic things to look at in our experience, because our mind is like a yo-yo, like it's going up and down all the time with these different kinds of experiences that we have no control over. We are not able to control the world. We are not able to control other people. We are not able to control even our own body and mind. And so, even though we try very hard to avoid unpleasant experiences, it's impossible. They do happen. And even though we try very hard to have nothing but pleasant experiences, we're not always able to have them, to experience them. And even when we do, how long do they last? How long does pleasure last? So, yeah, so that's a really important teaching on the 8 worldly concerns. And as long as we are caught up with these, as long as these are priorities in our life, trying to get the pleasant ones and avoid the unpleasant ones, we are like a worldly person, not a spiritual person. So how much we are concerned about the 8 worldly concerns determines how much we are really spiritual, someone who's on the spiritual path. So one of the first things we need to do, if we do want to follow the spiritual path, is to at least start working on these 8 worldly concerns and reducing our concern about them. We can't do that immediately. And in fact, what I've heard is to be completely free of the 8 worldly concerns, we need to realize emptiness, the true nature of things. So until that point, well, the direct realization actually. So until that point, there's still going to be traces of them in our mind, but we can at least be aware of them, notice them, and work on reducing them. And so a big part of that is learning to reduce attachment to the 4 of the 8 worldly concerns that are things we're attached to, like gain, praise, good reputation, and pleasure. But again, that doesn't mean, we can't be happy, we can't enjoy nice food and so on. It's a question of attachment. So we can do the things we need to do to keep our mind happy, but try our best not to have attachment to those things. So I'll talk about some ways we can reduce attachment. One of the best is contemplating impermanence. So I mentioned this already yesterday. Buddha talked about it a lot, really emphasized the importance of being aware of impermanence. It's a truth, it's a reality. It's not just a philosophical idea or a religious idea. It's just the way things are. They are impermanent. They are subject to change. So, for example, our bodies, our minds, all our belongings, our clothes, our shoes, our house, our electronic devices, and so on. And all the things in the world around us, all the other people and beings, and the things in nature, as well as the things produced by human beings. All of these things are by nature impermanent, meaning they don't remain the same. They change inevitably, and nobody can stop that. Nobody can stop the changing nature of things. It's just ongoing every minute, every second. So there's 2 levels of impermanence. One is coarse or gross impermanence, and that's things we can actually see, like when somebody dies, for example. There was a person who was alive, and then after one moment, they're dead. They're not alive anymore. So that's coarse impermanence. Right now it's autumn, and so at least in the northern hemisphere, we can see the leaves changing color and dying and falling off the trees. The days are getting shorter, the nights are getting longer, the weather's getting cooler. Okay, so these are signs of coarse impermanence, things that we can see with our eyes and very obvious. So the world, life is full of examples of impermanence, and it's really helpful to look at these and acquaint ourselves. This is the true nature of things. And it's, oh yeah, and then there's subtle impermanence. So subtle impermanence is not easy to perceive or even understand, although we can understand it from science, like especially physics, because all material things are composed of little particles that can be broken down further and further, and you know, molecules, atoms, and so on. So what they find is these little tiny particles are constantly moving, changing. They don't stay the same from one moment to the next. And so if that's happening on the subtle level of things, like our bodies, the tiny particles that make up our bodies are changing all the time. So that means our bodies are changing all the time. They don't stay the same from one moment to the next. And that's why we get old. Or we don't just get old when we get to be 60, but right from the moment we're born. Buddhism says aging starts the second moment of life. Right after a baby is born, and brand new newborn baby, you know, so cute, so sweet. Everybody's so excited, but it's starting to age right away. As soon as it's born, it's getting older. And then eventually as the years add up, then, you know, it starts to get wrinkled and gray hair and bent over and falling apart, and eventually an old person, and then eventually dying. So this is an ongoing process of change that's happening every minute, every second. We can't stop it. And also other things as well. Trees and mountains and furniture and food and so on. So all of these things are changing every moment. We can't see this with our eyes. You can to a certain extent if you look under a supersonic microscope, but we can know intellectually, we can know that that is happening. So contemplating impermanence, getting more familiar with impermanence, this changing nature of things, that's a really helpful way of overcoming attachment. Because when we have attachment to a person or an object, we have this kind of wish that they will not change, that they will always be there just the way they are right now, which is so nice, so pleasant, just making me so happy. So I want that to last and not change and not go away. So this is something that happens when we have attachment. And if we ask ourselves, looking at impermanence, the impermanent nature of things, is that realistic? Is it realistic to want that person or that object to remain exactly the same, just as they are right now, and not change, not go away, not die? I think it's easy to recognize that it's just not realistic. It's just wishful thinking, fairy tale thinking. Like when we're children, you know, we're told these fairy tales about the prince and the princess who meet and live happily ever after. And probably nobody really questions that. Like when we're kids, you know, we just believe it. Yes, I'll meet my Prince Charming, my Princess Charming, and we'll be happy forever and ever and ever. But come on, I mean, does that really happen? But still, you know, there's this aspect of our mind that is looking for that, wanting that, hoping for that. And so sometimes people jump from one relationship to another, trying to find this person that will make them happy forever after. So impermanence brings us down to earth. You know, this is the truth, this is the reality, and helps us to cut through those fantasies and expectations and attachments. But even with things like, you know, a cup of coffee or tea or a piece of cake, there's still this attitude like, oh, this is going to make me happy. Almost like, you know, it's going to totally satisfy me forever. And that kind of view, that way of thinking, it feeds our attachment, increases our attachment. It's like we're trying to get that permanent, lasting satisfaction and pleasure from objects. So getting more familiar with impermanence, it takes time. It's not going to happen immediately, but the more we contemplate impermanence, recognize impermanence, get familiar with impermanence, then the less we'll have that kind of grasping at things as if they're going to make me happy forever, because we realize it's just not true. It's not realistic. And also gross impermanence. We have this saying in English, you can't take it with you, with regard to money and whatever, how many pairs of shoes we have, and clothes and house and so on and so forth. So we're all going to come to the end of our life at some point and leave all of those things behind. So not everybody thinks about that or realizes that. They remain attached to their things right up to the last minute, which causes a lot of suffering at the time of death, a lot of sadness and anxiety. And Buddhism says it's really important at the time of death to have a mind that's peaceful, calm, free of attachment and grasping, free of anger and aversion, fear. This is another important reason for working on our disturbing emotions, because if we don't work on them during our life, then when we come to the end of our life, we're dying, ready to leave this life and go to the next one. We haven't learned to manage our disturbing emotions. They could come up very strongly at that time and make a mess of our mind. And that would be really bad. From the point of view of Buddhism, dying with disturbing emotions in our mind, it will most probably lead to an unfortunate rebirth in our next life. So we definitely want to avoid that. But even for people who don't believe in or have doubt about future lives, rebirth, if you think about how you would like to die, what would be the ideal scenario at the time of death? Do you want to die angry, frightened, attached, miserable? So probably not. You probably would like to be calm, peaceful, serene, feeling love and compassion for the people around you, not angry at them. And so if you would like to have that kind of death, then it makes sense to learn how to manage disturbing emotions now while we're alive. And then you'll have that under your belt and be able to do that at the time of death. Yeah, so contemplating impermanence, both the gross impermanence, like the fact that our life will come to an end, other people's lives will also come to an end, our loved ones are not going to be there forever. These are hard. It's hard to think about these things, face these things, but it's worthwhile. It's definitely worthwhile. Before my mother died, I was quite attached to my mother. Really loved her. She was a loving person. And as she was getting older, I knew it would be hard losing my mother. So I would try to meditate on it. I try to imagine, hearing the news that she was dying or being with her when she was dying, and prepare myself for that and what I would do, what would be the best way to respond, the best way to deal with that situation. And that was helpful. It did help. It was still difficult, but I think it would have been much more difficult if I had never done that kind of preparation. And then for our own death as well. Buddhism says it's really important to prepare ourselves for our death by just coming to accept that we are going to die. So there's this whole meditation in the Lam Rim, wonderful meditation, one of my favorite meditations, called the 9-point meditation on death. I won't go into it here, but you can easily find information about it. But it's basically about accepting we're going to die. It's inevitable, no way to avoid it. And we don't know when it's going to happen. That's another thing, because we may think, yeah, I know I'm going to die, but not for a long time. I'm not that old. I'm healthy. Well, that's got nothing to do with it. Healthy people die, young people die. So age and health have nothing to do with when death happens. And so, yeah, really, it could happen at any point in life. And do you want to die unprepared with a mind that's out of control? Or do you want to die ready for it and with a mind that you know how to manage and do something positive with? So this is a really helpful meditation, and there's lots of resources, lots of books about it. So I encourage you to look into those and do those practices, those meditations. But anyway, impermanence, both gross and subtle impermanence, are really helpful antidotes to attachment, because we just see clearly how useless it is. We can't hang on to things. We can't keep them there forever, unchanging. So better to let go. So another method for working on attachment is to try to see the object in a more realistic way, because we have this tendency to ignore faults or imperfections and focus on certain aspects of the object that we like, and then we even exaggerate those and may add onto those things that aren't even there. So when we do notice our mind is caught up in attachment and fantasies and expectations, it's good to take a step back from that and ask ourselves, is this true? Am I seeing the object in a realistic way? Yeah, what is my mind saying about this person or this object? And then, do a reality check. Is it really true? Is the person really like that? Is the object really like that? Is it really going to make me happy forever and ever? So that can be very helpful. And it can also be helpful to think of past experiences where you did get caught up in some kind of fantasy about a person or an object. And then what was the result of that? And how you probably were disappointed and let down and discovered things about the person or the object that you didn't notice before. I think I've told this story before, but it doesn't hurt to tell it again. A woman that I met said that she was married and she had this just exaggerated view of her husband, where she thought he was like a god, a Greek god. He was just so handsome and so wonderful and so perfect and all these fantastic qualities. And he could see that she was exaggerating, and he tried to tell her. He tried to say to her, I'm not really like that. You're exaggerating. But she didn't want to believe it. She didn't want to listen. She wanted to hang on to her fantasies. But eventually, I don't know how long it took, but eventually her kind of fantasies faded, and then she saw him in a more realistic way, the way he was. And then she didn't like him anymore. The marriage fell apart. They had a divorce. So that's just like a really clear example of what can happen with attachment. This aspect of attachment that fantasizes and exaggerates and paints an unrealistic picture of the object. So it can be helpful to just remind ourselves of those experiences we had in the past or other people's experiences, being let down after they discover that the object of attachment isn't as great as they thought it would be. And the same with not just people, but other kinds of things. Like if there's a particular kind of car that we think, oh, that car is so beautiful, so wonderful. If only I could have that kind of car, it would be so wonderful. So, you could remind yourself of the downside of having that kind of car. It's expensive. And when it gets, when it breaks down, you have to pay a lot of money to have it repaired. And then when you park it somewhere, if it is a really attractive, expensive car, other people might have attachment to it, and you may come out and find it's not there. Or it's been damaged, somebody scratched it. So all kinds of things can go wrong, or problems, that we don't normally think about when we're caught up in desire for an object. So it's good to remind ourselves of those and realize, okay, it's not going to be 100% fantastic. There will be problems. There will be difficulties. So that can help to tone down our attachment. You might still decide to buy that car, but you do it in a more realistic way with more realistic understanding and expectations. So let's see, I have to keep track of time. So I'm just looking at my email. There was one question that came in. Maybe I can take care of this one now. It's related to anger. It says, rightly enough, when you try to understand the other person who causes irritation and anger, what happens when the reason of the anger is exactly the fact you understand where the other is coming from? And is that understanding, the knowledge of the causes of the other person's suffering, that brings you anger? What can we do? In my case, to be more concrete, I am talking about my brother, because I know well where his suffering and bad behavior comes from. That is what makes me really angry sometimes and very hard to control. So I'm thinking that maybe this kind of understanding described here is more the surface or superficial understanding of the causes of the person's behavior. But in Buddhism, I mean, the more you understand Buddhism, the more you can understand the deeper causes for a person behaving the way they are. It's a little hard to go into all of that, but according to Buddhism, the root cause of all suffering and all afflictive emotions is ignorance about the true nature of things. And this is something that we are all afflicted by. We are all like in a cloud of confusion and ignorance, like about our own self, our own sense of self, I, me. We have this instinctive, innate belief that there is a real I. It seems like there is a real I somewhere inside that's talking and making decisions and controlling things and so on. So it seems like it's there. And most people never bother to check. And, is that true or not? They just go along with it. But the Buddha said, no, you need to check that sense of self, that sense of I. This is actually a big question, even at the time of Buddha and before the Buddha. a lot of Indian philosophers and religious teachers and meditators and so on were investigating this whole idea of the self, the I, and some of them believed that there is a soul, a real permanent soul existing on its own somewhere inside of us. They believed that, and they taught that to their followers. And so the Buddha must have learned that himself. But when he meditated, he investigated, he discovered, no, that's no such thing. It's a fantasy. Some kind of real, solid, permanent I or me or soul. It doesn't really exist. It can't be found when you look for it. So this is a really huge topic in Buddhism. It's one of the most difficult subjects. And could take a whole life or numerous lifetimes to really understand and really get to the bottom of and realize the absence, the emptiness of a real permanent, objectively existing self or I. But anyway, Buddhism says that instinctive belief in and grasping at such an I is the root of all our troubles. Because we have that view there in our mind, and we don't have to be taught that by our parents. As soon as we come out of the womb, as soon as we're born, we already have that. So even a little baby has that sense of self or I. And then based on that, there arise these other afflictions. I want. So desire, I want these people to be around me and treat me with affection and love. And I want these things that are attractive and make me, so again, babies, already you can see them grasping at the things that are pleasant and attractive and make them happy. But it continues all through our life. So that attachment, desire, craving arises from this ignorance. And then also aversion, the opposite. When we encounter people and objects, experiences that we don't like, that are unpleasant to us or threatening to us, and then we respond with anger, aversion, dislike, get away from me, leave me alone. I don't like you. I hate you. I'm going to get rid of you. So all these different forms of anger and hatred arise from that as well. So it's all based on this misconception of a self or an I, plus feeling I am more important than everybody else. I'm the most important person in the universe. So being caught up in self-centeredness and self-importance. And then all the other afflictions as well, like jealousy. Yeah, I want this and I don't have it and they have it. I have to get it. I can't stand the fact that they have it and not me. And pride or arrogance, I am so great. Look at me. I'm beautiful. I'm wonderful. I'm fantastic. I'm talented. I won this prize. I won that medal. So all these afflictions, all these afflictive states of mind are based on the sense of self or I. And when we carefully examine that sense of self or I, it falls apart. It's actually not there. But most people never bother to do that. They just go through life believing in all of these things and following these inclinations, these afflictions. And so, like with your brother, if you, I don't know what his behavior is, but yeah, if you apply that framework to your brother's suffering and bad behavior, then you might see it differently. I mean, you might still get angry. One of my brothers, for many, many years, most of his life, had addictive behaviors that would get him into trouble. And he's been in jail. He's been in the hospital. He's almost committed suicide. It's so painful, to see someone you love, someone you care about, having these self-destructive behaviors and also causing suffering to others as well. My parents, I was so worried about him, bailing him out. And yeah, so it is very, very painful to observe that. And yes, you can get angry about it. Why doesn't he change? Why doesn't he listen? But does that do any good? Does it help to get angry and frustrated? Is that going to change that person? Is that going to bring you any comfort or peace of mind? Probably not. But on the other hand, compassion, yeah, understanding this suffering he's experiencing and having compassion for him. And I mean, in Buddhism, of course, we try to help people, but you can't help somebody if they don't want to listen, if they don't want to change. You can't force somebody to change. So you try, it's worth trying, but don't expect that it's going to work. Otherwise, you get frustrated and angry. And prayer. And I really believe in the power of prayer. So that's something we do in Buddhism. You may not believe in that, but it's worth a try. There's actually lots of stories about most miracles happening as a result of prayer. Yeah, praying for somebody and then they change or they get better. So it's worth a try to make prayers, do meditation, and then dedicate the positive merit, the positive energy to that person. Do that on a regular basis. Just to give an example, when I was living in Singapore, there was one young woman who was coming to the Buddhist center where I was. She was super enthusiastic about Buddhism. And her parents were very opposed to what she was doing. She was still quite young. I think she was still in university. And they were not happy that she was spending all this time in the Buddhist center. They wanted her to go out and meet a guy and, do the normal things. Maybe they thought she was going to become a nun and that would be disaster. I don't know what they thought. But anyway, they were constantly kind of saying things to her and making life hard for her. So it was causing her a lot of suffering. So she just prayed a lot. Every day she would pray for her parents to change their minds. And they did. They started coming to the center too and got really enthusiastic, really into the Dharma. So I thought, oh, wow, that's a big turnaround. So there's no guarantee that we will get what we pray for, because it isn't just a matter of prayer, but the other person needs to have conditions within their own mind, like karmic seeds, the right kind of karmic seeds, and so on. So it's not 100% guaranteed that prayer will help, but it's worth a try. It's worth doing, and at least you have a sense you're doing something towards helping your brother, and it just might work. Like my own brother. He's been better the last couple of years. I think he's stopped his addictive behaviors. Well, to a certain extent, he kind of switches from one thing to another. So he stopped being addicted to one thing. Now he's addicted to something else. But anyway, I've sort of accepted that's where he's at. And I just keep giving him love and praying for him. And that's all I can do. So this is something that's really helpful, is to come to accept what our limitations are, what we can do and what we can't do. Okay, so that's helpful to think about. And for me, it was really helpful to look at the example of the Buddha and how, even the Buddha, he was so amazing, compassionate and wise and enlightened, but he wasn't able to change the minds of some of the people around him. Like his cousin Devadatta, who was jealous of him and even tried to kill him. So he was right there with the Buddha, but the Buddha couldn't go into his mind and change his mind. So even a Buddha can't do that. And if we're not a Buddha, then forget it. No way we can change somebody else's mind. So each person is responsible for their own mind your own karma. We can try our best to influence others, help others, pray for them, and so on. Hope that they will change, but expecting we can change them is just unrealistic and self-defeating. You'll just end up being frustrated. So I hope that's helpful. Venerable Pema.
I have two questions that are related. Do you want me to say one by one?
One at a time, yeah.
Okay, so the first one is, could you talk a little bit about working with attachment to spiritual mentors?
Attachment to spiritual mentors. Yeah, that's a good question. Also, we can get attached to the Dharma, to meditation. Yeah, so attachment can arise in the context of spiritual practice. So I think, it's better to have attachment to a spiritual mentor than to a movie star or a football player, because they're gonna help you. So in a way, attachment to a spiritual teacher means you're going to want to be with that person and listen to that person, pay attention to that person. And so then their good influence will be beneficial for you. And I mean, of course, it's better not to have attachment, but we can't just immediately stop having attachment. And so attachment to spiritual teachers and meditation is certainly better than what most people's attachments are. But ideally, we look at our mind, we notice if there's attachment in our mind, and look at faults that can arise as a result of that. For example, jealousy. If you're really attached to a spiritual teacher, then you crave attention and being close to that person. And then if you see somebody else is getting attention, somebody else is close, then jealousy can arise, and competition, and kind of maybe some nasty behavior. So looking at that, recognizing, those adverse consequences of attachment, then, try to work on it. And so like the methods I used, impermanence, you're impermanent, the teacher's impermanent. Also, attachment is impermanent. Attachment isn't something that's going to last forever. And you can notice in your mind, if you watch your mind, you can see sometimes you're more attached, sometimes less. Sometimes you're jealous when somebody else is getting attention from the teacher. Sometimes you're not. Sometimes you can feel happy for that person. So just to see that it's an impermanent phenomena rather than something fixed and permanent. And yeah, I guess we wouldn't want to think about the faults of our spiritual teacher in order to overcome attachment. That wouldn't be appropriate. But mainly just seeing the faults of attachment itself, seeing that state of mind, that kind of attitude is faulty and not helpful for spiritual practice. So yeah, focus more on the faults of the attachment rather than the object. And yeah, and be kind to yourself, be patient with yourself, because you can't immediately, like that, overcome it. So just notice that it's there. Try not to feed it and act it out. Apply antidotes and be patient. So in time it will decrease.
Then you talk about like at the time of death, I hear many anecdotes of people at the time of death, and they're shown the pictures of their lamas, their teachers, and they cry. And even recently heard this, Venerable Gache talks about a monk in Sarah who had dementia for many years. And towards the end of his life, a week before he died, he became lucid and thanked everybody, and also apologized because he went around hitting people with his cup. So then the day that he died, his attendant was not there, and a very junior monk was there, and he showed him a picture and he told the monk he was going to die. So he showed him a picture of His Holiness, and he cried and he died. So like, to me, it sounds like attachment, but it also sounds like a pretty good way to go.
Well, I think crying doesn't necessarily mean attachment. It could be just a awareness of the incredible kindness and compassion and the benefit you've received from that person. You know, just the tears of joy, tears of appreciation and gratitude. So, I mean, we can't know exactly what was going on in that person's mind, but yeah, it does sound like a good way to go. Looking at a photo of His Holiness and then crying. So, yeah. Yeah, so it's said to be very important to prepare ourselves for death and learn, like, you know, kind of decide what kind of practices we would like to do. There's even a Dharma will. When a woman in New Zealand who started a hospice, a Dharma hospice, created this document that's a Dharma will, where you can write down what kind of practices you want people to do in your presence as you're dying, and you know, if you can't do them yourself, you want people to help you to do those, and so on. So it's good to prepare for that, not just leave it till the last minute. So let's see. Okay, I thought to talk about another afflictive emotion that people often ask about, although it's not on the usual list of afflictions explained in the Tibetan tradition, and that is fear. And there's probably been a lot more fear in the last couple of years. I heard a lot of people, because of COVID and the pandemic, a lot of people suffered from fear and anxiety. So I sort of, and just in my own experience, you know, I've had to deal with fear, and so I've found I have a list of things that are helpful. So I'll talk about these now, and then maybe at the beginning of the next session after the break, we can do a meditation. So for one thing, fear isn't necessarily something negative. It can be healthy. It can be wholesome. So it depends on what it is we're afraid of and what we do with our fear. Because in some cases, you know, you can just get overwhelmed by fear, paralyzed by fear, incapacitated so that you can't think and can't act, and you're just like frozen with fear. That's not helpful. On the other hand, if it is wholesome fear and realistic fear, there really is a threat, then it can mobilize you to act and do something, to either escape, run away, or protect yourself, or do something to deal with your fear. So, so what I find helpful is to face the fear, and you can do this in a meditative situation. Sit down and calm your mind, and then focus on the fear that you have, and then explore it. Like, try to understand what this fear is all about, because sometimes it's we're not that clear, you know, there's just this feeling of vague fear and anxiety, but we don't really know what it is we're afraid of. So it is helpful to understand that. What is it that I'm afraid of? So it's good to sort of take a step back and look at the fear and analyze what is it all about? What am I afraid of? And try to do this in an objective way, not all caught up in the fear, but almost like you're talking to the fear, asking, what's going on? What are you afraid of? Like talking to a little child. If a little child is frightened, the best thing would be to sit down and ask them, what are you afraid of? Why are you afraid? So let the fear talk and express itself. And while doing that, then you might discover things that you can then work with. So one thing to check would be, is the fear reasonable or not? Like what it is you're afraid of. How likely is it that it will happen? Is it 100% definite that this awful thing will happen? Or is maybe 50% or 10% or 5%, whatever? So just try to assess the certainty of what you're afraid of actually happening. For example, I've heard that there's many people who are afraid of going into airplanes, flying in airplanes, because they're certain that if they get into an airplane, it's going to crash and they're going to die. But then I once saw an article about the statistics of plane crashes, like the number of planes that take off and land and the number that crash. And it's extremely small. A very, very, very small percentage of planes actually crash. On the other hand, cars, there's a much higher rate of crashes with cars, but I've never heard of anybody afraid of getting in a car and driving in a car. So it's kind of irrational. It's not rational, that fear of flying. Although some people say, well, you think if you're in a car and you're about to crash, you can jump out, but you can't do that with an airplane, unless you have a parachute. So you feel more trapped and more kind of doomed if something goes wrong with the plane. But still, looking at the statistics, it's not very rational to be afraid of flying. Or another example might be if you're a student and you have an exam coming up and you're terrified of this exam, you think, it's going to be awful and you're going to fail and whatever, then, is that realistic? Is it absolutely 100% certain that you're going to fail? And also looking at this way, this kind of thinking, you can ask yourself, okay, it might happen. What I'm afraid of might happen, but is there something I can do to prevent it? Because often there are things we can do to prevent what we're afraid of. So like if you're afraid of failing an exam, prepare for it. I mean, that's like obvious. Study, arrange your life, make sure you get enough sleep and eat and healthy food, and put yourself in a good situation where you can really study and just put all your effort into that. So if you do that, there's a greater chance that you won't fail, that you will pass the exam. So this exercise then can sometimes help us think more realistically. Yeah, I'm afraid of this happening, but there are steps I can take, things I can do to prevent it from happening. So do those things. Organize yourself to do those things. And then, you might still think, yeah, but I still might fail because I really prepared for another exam before and I failed that one, so I might fail this one too. So yeah, it's possible that what it is you're afraid of will happen. But then another thing you can check is, will that be the end of the world? So sometimes we kind of blow up this horrible scenario that we're afraid of and think, I won't be able to live after that. It will just be the end of the world, the end of everything. I'll have to jump out of my window and, kill myself. So again, this is exaggerated. There's lots of people. What I find helpful is there's lots of people who've been through that kind of experience and survived. They didn't fall apart. They didn't jump out the window. They were okay and didn't even mind. Some people don't care if they fail an exam. They're still happy. They still have a happy life. So that's helpful too, to realize that maybe you're exaggerating the horribleness of what it is you're afraid of. And you could take comfort from the cases of other people who have gone through that experience and came out okay. And you could also look for help. Yeah, if you're struggling to deal with this on your own, then seek help. Talk to somebody, get some advice. Even like somebody who has been through that experience may be able to talk to you and give you help, what they did, how they managed it. So look for help. And then there's also spiritual help. Like in Buddhism, we talk about taking refuge in the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, the three jewels. And other religions have other, like in Catholicism, Christianity, they have Jesus, God, the saints, and so on. So it's quite common when people feel afraid or anxious, troubled, that they turn for help to some spiritual object. Like for Buddhists, it would be the Buddha. There's also many Buddhas. There's Tara, there's Chenrezig, Medicine Buddha. So different people feel different affinity with different Buddhas. So if you have your favorite Buddha or Bodhisattva, then you could just bring that one to mind and ask them for help. So that can be very comforting, very helpful, because then you don't feel alone. You don't feel like I'm all alone having to deal with this difficult situation. Once when I was living in Singapore, somebody asked me to go and visit this woman who was in the hospital. I didn't even know her, but apparently she had just been diagnosed with something and had to go for an operation the very next day. So it was all very sudden for her. And apparently she was just freaking out with fear. And so I went to see her and I walked into the hospital room and she was standing there looking completely happy and radiant. And I was like, I thought she was supposed to be terrified. And she explained that the previous day she had been really, really upset, really frightened. But then that night she had a dream about Kuan Yin. She saw Kuan Yin in her dream. And that gave her tremendous relief. She realized, I'm not alone. Kuan Yin is there. Kuan Yin is going to take care of me. I'll be okay. So that was a really stark example of how, yeah, feeling a connection with some. If you're not familiar with Kuan Yin is the Chinese version of Chenrezig, Avalokiteshvara, usually a female form, very beautiful, sweet, motherly. And so many Chinese people feel very close to Kuan Yin and pray to Kuan Yin and rely on her for help and guidance. So yeah, so she got great comfort. So that shows how, yeah, having an object of refuge that we can turn to, pray to, feel is there with us. And that gives a lot of strength and courage and can help chase away our fear. And also there's this verse in Shantideva that I always like. It says, why be unhappy about something if it can be remedied? But I think we could also talk about this with worry or fear. Why be worried about something if it can be remedied? And why be worried about something if it can't be remedied? So the basic idea is to be practical. You know, if you're worried about something, afraid of something, ask yourself, is there something I can do, you know, to deal with the situation? Like studying for your exam, or if you're afraid of an airplane crash, yeah, I guess you can decide not to take a plane, take a train instead. So there's often things that we can do about something we're afraid of or worried about. So if there is something that can be done, do it. Don't just, I mean, it's just so useless to let your mind just go around and around and around with these thoughts of worry and anxiety. It just makes you unhappy, makes you more frightened, and it doesn't lead to anything good, anything constructive. So instead of that, ask yourself, is there something that can be done? And if there is, do it. At least try. What we try may not work, but at least we're trying. And then the second part of this verse says, and so if there's nothing that can be done, if it's unavoidable, what use is it to worry? What use is it to just let your mind get stuck in these thoughts of worry and anxiety? So for example, death. Okay. Well, there's nothing we can do to not die. That's impossible. But there are things we can do to prepare for it. So there's many people who are able to die with a peaceful state of mind. Like my mother, I was with my mother when she died, and I was just like amazed how peaceful she was. She wasn't frightened. She wasn't attached to her home or her family or anything else. She was ready to go. And I could see it was mainly because of her religious faith. She'd been very devoted to God her whole life. And she even said to somebody asked her, "Aren't you afraid?" And she said, "No," because I know God has taken very good care of me my whole life, and I know he's going to take care of me now. So again, having that faith in some spiritual object gave her a tremendous calm and peace and the ability to even be cheerful and positive. At this moment, that is probably the most difficult moment of our life for many people. So, and Buddhism says as well, if we prepare ourselves for death by creating a lot of virtue, good karma, familiarizing our minds with positive states like compassion and love and faith and devotion, and just trying to be a really good person as much as we can and avoid doing hurtful things. And even if we do negative things, they can be purified. So there's practices we can use to purify our negative karma. So we practice those things during our life. It'll be easy to remember them at the time of death and have a peaceful mind and a peaceful death. On the other hand, some people they don't want to think about death. They just totally avoid. Don't talk to me about death. Don't mention death. I don't want to look at it. I don't want to think about it. They just want to totally avoid that whole subject. So they're not going to be very prepared at the time of death. There's a good chance that their mind will just be overwhelmed by fear and anxiety and other kinds of disturbing emotions. So there is something we can do even about the fear of death. We can't avoid dying. It's definitely going to happen, but we can at least avoid a unpeaceful death, a frightening death, a painful death. I'll just mention one more thing. Then there's a couple of questions from Arnaud. So the Dalai Lama says compassion, altruism is also a way to increase courage and confidence. So he was asked by Howard Cutler, who's the author of this book, The Art of Happiness. In one place in the book, Howard Cutler, who's a psychologist, asked the Dalai Lama, when you get up and talk in front of thousands of people, do you feel afraid? Because that's, for many people, that's really terrifying. To have to give a public talk, especially to such a huge audience. And the Dalai Lama said, yes. I don't know if he was just saying that, but anyway, but then he said, but what I do is I think about the people the audience and generate the wish to benefit them. Because fear is all about me. That kind of fear is about me. Oh, will I do a good job? Will I look good? Will they like me? Yeah, so that leads to fear. But if you think about the people there who are going to be listening to the talk, I want to do something good for them. I want to benefit them. I want them to be happy. So you're turning your focus away from me to them, and automatically that dispels the fear and gives courage. So yeah, so that's something else that can help in situations where we may be afraid, is to turn your attention away from me to others. What can I do to help others, to make them happy, to relieve their suffering? So those are some things I have found helpful to do about fear and anxiety. Okay, so we have a little bit of time left, and there's a couple of questions from Arnaud, people in France. So one question says, I have been abused by someone, and I have been and still am really upset against him. I am angry when I think about him, and I worry to feed the link or create karmic link by overthinking or praying for him to be happy, to lose the knot. And I can feel it on the level where I don't want him to be happy. A little unsure what this means. But anyway, it sounds like, okay, so someone else has abused oneself, and you naturally feel angry thinking about that person, and don't want to increase the karmic link by thinking too much or praying for this person to be happy. So there seems to be concern. If I think about that person too much and pray for that person to be happy, then I'm increasing the karmic link. Well, on the other hand, I think Buddhism would say, if somebody has abused us, harmed us, then this is because of the karma we created in the past, that we behaved abusively, harmfully, and maybe to that very person, maybe in past lives, we did the same kind of abuse to that person. And so we did have that karmic link. And that's why we're meeting that person in this life, and they're treating us in that way. They're abusing us in that way. And so the best way to kind of stop that kind of karmic link with another person is by generating compassion for them. Because if you get angry and then you want to retaliate, or even just wish that person to suffer, you're creating more bad karma, which will, keep you bound to that person, connected with that person, and again, in unfortunate ways. So I'll tell a story. Kind of illustrates this. I read this story in a book by a Zen teacher living in New York. And he said one of his students she had difficulty with someone at work. There was this other man in the office where she was working, and she and this other man just didn't get along at all. There was like this constant friction and tension between them. And one day when she was meditating, she remembered a past life. And in the past life, this was like back in the medieval times in France or somewhere, she was a woman and she had this baby. And when the baby was still just an infant, she realized the baby was blind and also deaf. And I guess because she thought, this child will just have an awful life, it's better, not to allow it to live. So she put a pillow over the baby baby's face and pressed down on it until it suffocated. And so she remembered this, and she realized this was the guy in the office. And she said, well, she remembered this, suffocating the baby. She said she could feel the anger. The baby was angry at what was happening. And so that anger, anyway, who knows about karma? But anyway, this is what she remembered. And then she thought, okay, now I understand why I don't get along with this guy. And then she had the thought, maybe I'll try to talk to him about it. And so she invited him for coffee, and he agreed. And she was kind of not sure how he would react. She thought he might think she was crazy. But when she told his story, he accepted it. He was accepting of it. And they had a talk about it, and then they cleared the air. That sort of cleared the air between them. So I think that does illustrate how, instead of, hanging on to anger towards somebody that abused us in real reality or just in our imagination, it's better to try to accept some karmic responsibility for it, even if we can't actually remember what we may have done in the past that was harmful to this person, but just to think, I probably did do something harmful to that person, and that's why this is happening now. And then try to clear that karma so that it doesn't continue the rest of this life and future lives, and we keep meeting each other and hurting each other and having problems with each other. So it is difficult, especially with someone who's abused us. And I think it's also good to deal with the pain of abuse. I mean, if you can't do that on your own, get help from therapy to deal with your own pain and suffering, because yeah, it can be very damaging to be abused. So find help with that so that you can cure yourself, relieve yourself of that suffering. But then with regard to the other person, contemplate. I'm not saying this is what you have to do, but at least think about trying to clear up your anger and generate forgiveness of the other person. And it's good for you to do that as well, not just for the, for the other person. It's for your own good, because hanging on to anger is so painful. Anger is a really, really painful state of mind. Yeah, and it's an obstacle to spiritual growth. So you benefit yourself. You do an act of kindness to yourself by learning to let go of the anger, however hard it may be, however much time it may take. It may take the whole life, but it's worth doing. So even to have the wish, to see the value of doing that and have the wish to do that is already a step in a helpful direction. So I hope that helps. Okay, another question about fear. What would be the antidote to fear without a precise object when it arises, without apparent reasons? Yeah, so let's see. Let me think about that. I'll talk about that after the break. Yeah, so I guess sometimes there may just be a vague feeling of fear, not really sure what it is you're afraid of. But it could also be that you just need to go deeper into yourself, to take more time to understand what this fear is about, where is it coming from. But yeah, if I can think of more things, I'll bring that up in the next session. Any last questions from here on the floor?
I just want to get your thoughts on this. I took a teaching with another teacher online who's a Tibetan teacher, but anyway, he was talking in the framework, the language that he used, as I understood it, is he was really relating fear and attachment. So he was like talking about the three poisons being hatred, fear, and I don't remember what he called the third one. But he was really replacing attachment with that word fear in the context of what he was teaching, which I thought was interesting. I don't know how I feel about it, but I wonder how that strikes you.
I mean, the first thing that pops up in my mind is there is a certain amount of fear involved with attachment, because when we have attachment to a person or an object, naturally there will be fear about losing. Yeah, it may not be so obvious, but an underlying fear. What if this person dies or goes away, leaves me, stops loving me? So, and the same with money, yeah, or any material possessions we have, there's fear. So we're attached, we want it to be there, we don't want to lose it, we don't want it to go away. Naturally, there's fear because we know it could go away, it could disappear. So yeah, I think it would be very hard to have attachment and not have fear of losing what we're attached to. So maybe that's the reason for saying that. Yeah, and I think if we recognize that, people may not be so enthusiastic about overcoming attachment. Oh, attachment's kind of nice, it brings me happiness. But if we recognize there's a fear there, fear isn't such a pleasant experience, pleasant state of mind. They might be more willing to want to work on overcoming attachment. That's just the first thing that pops in my mind. Yeah. So let's stop here and have a break. We'll meet after half an hour. So let's just mentally dedicate the merit, the positive energy of this last 2 hours. Having a positive motivation, listening, thinking about, meditating on these teachings of the Buddha and how to decrease disturbing emotions so that we can be more helpful to others. So let's share this merit, this positive energy with others, that it will help all beings be free of these painful, disturbing emotions and find genuine peace and happiness, especially the happiness of enlightenment. Okay, let's have a break.